So, Novin, are you okay?
Yes.
Yes? Cool. All right, so
You look great.
I think we're just waiting for the record button. Oh, it's recording already. That's great. Cool. Okay. So before we kind of get going, I did want to say something about the Emirates Natural History Group, and I do wonder, you probably really will struggle to see this. Can you see any writing on here? Probably not.
Yes, something speaker.
Something natural, something like that. Yeah.
All right, cool. So I have to tell you that this dish was given to the very first speaker at the Emirates Natural History Group, and it was in 1977. And the first talk was in Abu Dhabi. So our parent group is the Abu Dhabi Natural History Group. And Al Ain started about 5 years later. Hello. So yeah, so Al Ain started about 5 years later. And we also have a chapter, a Dubai Natural History Group. And the latest or the youngest chapter is actually in Ras Al Khaimah. And that chapter only got going a very short while ago. And it's really nice because the other chapters have rallied around and are trying to support and help. And it's just lovely because all that we have in common is that we're interested in natural history, heritage, history, archaeology of the UAE, Northern Oman, and the region. And so with that, I think I will start and I will share my screen. And here it goes. So, thank you for coming to a talk called In the Eye of the Beholder. This is all about discussing mimicry in insects, but it is also a little bit more. And whilst I'll be talking about some of the work that I did a very long time for my PhD, I'm drawing parallels between some of the insects that I was studying and some of the insects that we actually have here in the UAE. And actually, to be honest, it's not only insects. I'll be talking about some other arthropods as well. I would like to say that you will see quite a few photographs. Any photograph that is taken by me doesn't have a caption or doesn't have a copyright on it, but any photograph that I've either borrowed from one of my friends or I've downloaded from the Creative Commons, I have got the link there. And if any of you are interested later on in any of these images or anything, just let me know, just be in touch, okay? So, of course, we can't start the presentation without a picture of a hoverfly. So a hoverfly is basically a fly, but it belongs to the group Syrphidae or the family Syrphidae. And all Syrphidae have something in common. If you wanted to go out in the field and identify what a syrphid looks like, then there are certain characters on its wing that would help you to tell you that it is a syrphid, but also its overall body shape and its eyes. But a lot of hoverflies actually also look a little bit like bees or wasps. And this is why I was interested in them. Because my PhD was really looking at why there are different mechanisms that insects have to defend themselves and why others will look like those insects that are somehow defended. When I talk about defenses, what do I mean? I mean things like camouflage, for example. Some insects or arthropods are chemically defended. Some have weapons. Others have some kind of coloration that immediately make you look at them and think, oh, that looks either venomous or poisonous. And then obviously there is mimicry, which is that mechanism that I want to talk about the most, but I will focus also on some of these others. Before we start, I would also like to just tell you the difference between an organism that is poisonous and that is venomous. So if you're venomous, then you have some kind of poison that you can inject or spray or cover yourself in. Whereas if you're poisonous, then if, for example, you're a caterpillar, you're poisonous, you're ingested, then you're going to be causing some kind of toxic reaction in the organism that has eaten you. So there's a slight difference between being poisonous and being venomous. But of course, mimicry is what I really want to look at. However, let's have a look at some of the examples. So for example, camouflage. Maybe one of the most recognizable organisms is something that looks a little bit like that. And what this is actually a leaf insect, although it's in the group of the stick insects, which are probably those that we remember a little bit more. They occur in many parts of Australasia. And of course, if you see one of them here on a bark like that, well, then it stands out and you can recognize it. But when it does its real thing, like camouflage, then it might occur on a leaf, and it might actually be much more difficult for you to find it or to see it. And whilst these occur in Australasia, do we have any insects or arthropods that use camouflage? Well, we do. And there are so many that to choose one would be quite difficult, except for I had the good fortune that my friends Roxanne and Sean recently went to our Wadi Canaan and were able to see this very attractive grasshopper, which is a Truxalis longicornis. I know it's standing out and you can kind of see it, but if you were looking down on top of that, the mottled wings that it has would kind of help it camouflage. And then sometimes if you look at it from a different angle, you wouldn't barely ever see it. And can you see it now? So in fact, if it's placed on vegetation, it's really well camouflaged. And that is a young one here, if you can spot it, because its wings are not covering the whole of the abdomen, the whole of that length at the end. So this is a juvenile Truxalis. But that is a typical example of the kind of camouflage where you're hiding yourself. So camouflage a lot of the time is because you are trying to blend in, you're trying to protect yourself from being detected. But there is other kinds of defenses, and some of the defenses include chemical defense, and I'm linking something else to that called warning coloration. I think to a lot of you around the world, this will be an organism that you recognize as a wasp because it's yellow and black. It has a waist that is small. And we kind of know when we see this that this is something that we probably want to be careful of. Now, it's interesting because when an organism has venom, it can either be glandular, so it can be contained in venom sacs, which can be either used to spray or ooze over an organism. It can be a sticky coating, or there could in fact also be non-glandular venoms. And what they are more involved maybe with, or there might be a systemic toxin that is within the organism. Now, we all know the reason that we don't particularly like wasps, and that's because they can deliver a powerful sting. So we know that for a wasp, it is a gland or a venom sac that is then basically used with a stinger to defend itself. So that's what it's all about. It's about a defense. But now what this wasp is also doing at the same time is it's in fact warning you. Black and white, black and yellow, red and black, orange and black, all of these different combinations are all actually warning coloration that many organisms use and many insects use to in fact warn that they are poisonous or venomous or somehow defended. And this is in a way to try and avoid being eaten. So it is a defense. It's not only chemical defense, but it's also the warning coloration. Now, you might recognize that different groups of organisms will have different kinds of venoms, but it's very interesting that many of these invertebrates or insects and arachnids have venom that can be potent for different organisms, some for mammals, some for other insects, and so on. So the combination of the cocktail that some of these organisms have is in fact targeted to defend itself against many different kinds of predators. Now, what's of course interesting is to know, do we have any kinds of wasps here in the UAE? And I'm sure most of you will recognize this particular one. This is a paper wasp, Pelistes vatae. Now, it is not striped in the same way in terms of yellow and black, but it's certainly brightly colored. And I don't know if any of you have ever been stung by them, but they are quite painful. Now, this is an unfortunate event that you're looking at here, because these wasps, I mean, they're not really after people or mammals. What they really want is they want to eat protein, and most of them will eat other insects. And in this case, it's eating a rather rare fly called a Midas fly. Now, warning colorations are around us everywhere, and we all can associate ladybugs with some kind of maybe stroll in vegetation. And you know what? That is warning coloration. And it was extremely hilarious, a story that I can tell you about my PhD external examiner, Graham Holloway, who did a study in crunching up ladybugs in his mouth, because he had a theory about them. And his theory was that they don't all taste as bad as each other. And he was absolutely right. There are some ladybugs, when you crunch them up, their internal fluids are just horrible and they taste really vile. But then there are others, when you crunch them up, they're not quite as bad. And this begs the question, well, what is going on here? Who is a model? Who is a mimic? Is there some kind of maybe group protection that some of these ladybugs get? And indeed, we often find them hibernating as a group rather than as individuals. So it's just an interesting strategy that ladybugs have. But either way, they are very distasteful when you eat them. So the warning coloration is to let you know that it's distasteful. Now, this is in fact photographed in the UAE, but it isn't only adults. It's sometimes also some of the juvenile stages. And this is in fact a giant skipper caterpillar that I photographed many, many years ago in Wadi Tarabat at the base of Jebel Hafid. And it actually feeds on a Cridocarpus orientalis, which I thought was poisonous, but I couldn't really find many references about that. But I did learn that it has quite a lot of substances in the leaves that are sometimes even used also medicinally. But however these substances are laid down in the caterpillar, it is giving it some protection. It is also distasteful. And so again, here is the warning coloration, the stripiness, letting a predator know that it is unpleasant and therefore keep away. Now, of course, we associate venom very often with some of the arachnids. And so here's a spider that I photographed in Oman. And of course, we know that spiders generally inject venom in order to kill their prey. And their prey is often other insects, but not always. Now, it's very interesting that some of these spiders are actually not so keen to immediately inject their venom. The reason is that sometimes in their webs they catch organisms that are quite big or that have some kind of defense, like a wasp or a bee, and they could themselves then get hurt. So the strategy of some spiders is immediately bite, and some it is to immediately wrap, such as is done by some of the orb weaving spiders. And here's an orb weaver that I found at our wadi in Kinan only a few weeks ago. So this is an argiope that was identified as argiope by Binish for me in the past, but also by Gary Fulner. So just fascinating to know that, you know, we have all of these different organisms, they all have these different strategies. But if I was to ask you, and please, I don't want an answer, but if I was to ask you which is the organism that we maybe are the most worried about in the UAE in terms of venom or venomous, then I think you would probably agree with me that it might be a boothid scorpion. Now, scorpions, as you might know, have actually quite poor vision and are generally nocturnal. And so, you know, if you're nocturnal, there's no real benefit and investing an awful lot of energy in good eyesight when you could find another way of maybe picking up vibrations. And so, in fact, on their tummy or on their ventral body parts, they've got some very interesting structures, like a double structure called a pectine. And these pectines are actually helping scorpions to pick up both mechanical but also chemical stimuli. And this in a way compensates for these organisms not having very good eyesight. Now, scorpion venom is quite interesting because it contains some very common constituents like water and salts, but it also has other smaller molecules, peptides and proteins. And the toxins have a very interesting action. They actually bind to ion channels in cell membranes, often in neurons, and they actually block the passage of ions through the membrane channels. And so that is the reason that it is a bit of a problem when a scorpion stings. I don't know if you know this, but when a scorpion actually stings, it injects fluid, which is obviously liquid, but it has two different kinds. It initially, its first sting has a pre-venom, and that causes localized pain, whereas the next time it stings, it has the actual venom in it. And from what I've been reading in some references, there's actually very little known about the mechanism of how the scorpions keep these different constituents separate. And I guess there could be a PhD in that. That's quite an interesting process. So that was just kind of, if you like, an overview and some kind of the defenses that organisms have that we already maybe knew about. And how does that lead us to mimicry? Well, mimicry is another strategy to defend yourself or to hide yourself or to ensure your survival. And there are, in fact, many kinds of mimicries, and we won't have time to discuss them all, unfortunately. But aggressive mimicry is quite interesting. And aggressive mimicry is when an organism maybe makes itself look different in order to prey on that particular species that it's mimicking. So this is not an ant. It looks like an ant. It's not an ant. It's an ant-mimicking spider. And it preys on ants. And so it's able to infiltrate the colonies or get close to the ants, and it's not recognized. I think one of the thoughts is that it somehow is able to also mimic the odor of a colony, and therefore is not detected by the ants, and then can actually prey on them. So this is known as aggressive mimicry. Matenzian mimicry, which was listed, is something that I don't want to get into because it's actually quite complicated to explain. But the kinds of mimicry that I've been interested ever since I did my PhD is in fact the difference between Batesian mimicry and another kind of mimicry called Mullerian mimicry. And these two types of mimicries are fascinating because in one you have a mechanism that makes complete sense, but the other one it doesn't. So I want to start with the one that makes sense, which is the Mullerian mimicry. In Mullerian mimicry, you have a pattern that is shared by many different organisms belonging to different groups. So what are we looking at? We're looking at a wasp, which we already saw earlier, but we're also looking at a beetle. And in fact, Tama, I think I saw you earlier. That was something that we photographed together at the DDCR. Now, both of them share a pattern of orange and black or yellow and black stripes. And if you imagine a predator, and a predator will have to learn what it can and can't eat. Well, here, all of these organisms are somehow defended. The beetle is very distasteful, and we know that the wasp is defended by a sting. So now the bird, let's imagine it's a bird that is the predator of these. After trying one or the other, will learn to avoid anything that resembles that pattern. And so this was described by a scientist called Müller for the first time, that there's almost like a mimicry ring of all these different organisms that look similar to one another, are all somehow chemically or otherwise defended and therefore protect one another. When it comes to Batesian mimicry, it's quite different. And this was first described by Henry Walter Bates in South American butterflies, and they belonged to different families. Now, Bates was able to observe them very, very closely, and he recognized that even though most of them were a particular species, in between he would see some that looked a little different. And in fact, what he was describing was the resemblance of one butterfly that is not at all poisonous to the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly, as some of you might know, feeds on milkweed, and the poisons or the substances are deposited in the body, and this renders the butterfly toxic. Birds, when they learn to eat it, have actually been seen to vomit. This really causes them quite a lot of discomfort. And so birds learn through that experience to avoid anything that resembles this particular color pattern. And if you remember us earlier talking about warning coloration, so here you've got orange and white and black, and these are true warning colorations. And so what Henry Walter Bates was able to do was to show for the first time that there were some butterflies that seemed to mimic butterflies that were toxic, but the mimic itself was not toxic. And this is fascinating. Unbelievably, these mechanisms are in all kinds of organisms. And for me in particular, I've been interested in the flies and the hoverflies, as I was saying earlier, the Syrphidae, because they are Batesian mimics of bees and wasps and this particular group. So just as a recap, Batesian mimicry means that the fly is completely edible, is not chemically or otherwise defended, but it resembles an organism that is defended. What we were able to see in our study was that in fact, there are some hoverflies that look exactly like a particular bee or wasp, and then there are some that don't look anything like, or very vaguely only. So I want to start with Bumble Bee Mimics, and we don't have bumblebees in the UAE, but we have some organisms that are similar. So, and we'll get onto that in a minute. So I'm going to show you a whole pile of images. So here are all kinds of different hoverflies that occur in the UK, and they all mimic bumblebees. So you can see there's quite a range of them, and what they all have in common is that they vary in size, either to mimic the queen or the worker, but they all are furry. These are flies, remember, they're not bees, and yet they have changed over time, evolutionary time, to look like bumblebees. And if I show you specifically, here is one bumblebee. This is the model. So we know the model will be somehow chemically defended. It has a sting. And here is an example of a mimic. And this is a particular hoverfly. Now, if you are a mimic, it would obviously not be in your favor if you were always around and a bird, when it's learning what it can and can't eat as a juvenile bird, experiences you first, then it might actually kill a few flies before it eventually gets to a bumblebee. So our theory during my PhD was, well, if they are really mimics of the bumblebee, if you're out in the environment, you would expect to find more of the model and less of the mimic. And so I was lucky enough to be able to show that. So there were different kinds of hoverflies that I was studying, and the hoverflies are the filled in symbols. And then I looked at the model, and the model was always more frequent in the environment than the mimic. And the mimic would spread itself throughout the year as well, so that it wouldn't always be present. And that was also very interesting. So there were different kinds of hoverflies, all resembling that same bumblebee, but they didn't all fly at the same time. So that was one of the results that we found out. And here is another example of a model. So here's a different kind of a bumblebee, maybe the more common one that we recognize, the stripy yellow, black and white one. And there are all sorts of hoverflies in the UK and Europe and other places that mimic them. So here is an assemblage of all of these. And the same story, we were able to show that the bumblebee was far more common than any of the mimics, so the flies that look like them but don't have the sting. So that brings us on to, well, do we have anything like that in the UAE? Do we have any examples, furry bee mimics? Well, unbelievably, we have one of the most beautiful flies I've ever seen to date. This is Paraschistus pulchellus, and to all of you, I can tell you that this is a new to the UAE record. And it is thanks to the ENHG that we found it, because during IEW, some of us went into the mountains and were amazed to find a meadow of this flower that you can see. And very quickly, I saw what I thought was a bee fly, and I wasn't quite sure at first. And as soon as I managed to photograph it and look at it, I immediately recognized it. But I knew, Mohammed, it occurs in Kuwait, but it doesn't occur, it has never been recorded from the UAE. It also occurs in Oman. So this was a new record. And so some of us actually went back and studied it a little bit more. And for example, Roxanne and I are now writing this up as a chapter because it's a new record for the UAE. And I don't know what you think, but as a fly, I think this is just tremendous. It's absolutely stunning, and it's quite big, and it was hovering. And here is just a different view for you. It's a very fascinating insect. So those were bumblebee mimics or furry bee mimics. There are also those mimics, so flies that look like social wasps. And social wasps are those wasps that are black and yellow and stripy, like we said earlier on. And so here is one of the most common hoverflies that you might come across. And we do have it here in the UAE as well, although I photographed that in the UK. And I'm calling this non-specific. Remember earlier on I talked about some hoverflies that look really like a particular hoverfly, model, like a bumblebee or a wasp. And then there are those that, well, they resemble them vaguely. They have something in common. And here you can see it's the stripiness, the yellow and the black. But this fly behaves differently to a wasp. It's not as big as a wasp. It just might confuse a would-be predator long enough for it to get away. And there are many of them, of these hoverflies that look like a wasp, but only vaguely. And I'm just bringing up a whole pile of them. Some of these don't occur in the UAE. This particular one, Cervus visa, does. And then here is a Spheriphoria. So these are examples of some of these flies, hoverflies that look a little bit like wasps, but not really that specifically. And here is another one from the UAE. So this is also one that has caused Roxanne and I a little bit of an interest, because we have been isolating flies from our sample from Wadi Kinan, where we have been trapping insects now for almost 5 years. And we went to a conference last year, and we took some of these samples with us, and we asked for someone to verify them. And it very quickly turned out that we were looking at 2 different species of Ischiodon. And these Ischiodon normally don't occur both in the same country. One of them is an Afrotropical and the other one is an Asian species. And in fact, we for the first time have been able to show that they both occur together here. And this is, again, another new record that both Roxanne and I are writing up right now as a chapter. So this was also exciting. So even though it's a non-specific mimic, it has an interesting little story, and we were very happy to find this. So if I'm talking about a non-specific wasp mimic, what would a specific mimic look like? Well, rather like a wasp. And okay, this is from a museum in Natural History Museum in London. And can you see that the pattern of the yellow and black is so much closer to what you would expect a wasp to look like? It even has evolved slightly longer antennae, which flies don't normally have. And it even, through the way that black color meets between the thorax and the abdomen, it almost looks like it got a pinched waist, which is very wasp-like as well. So the mimicry is really intricate in this particular Chrysotoxin species, which is very interesting. Now, we've talked about bumblebee mimics, we've talked about social wasp mimics. Now, we also know that we have honeybees or social bees. Are there any mimics of those? Well, yes, there are. And in fact, some of the hoverflies are, that are the most famous come from the honeybee mimics, like this particular species here, which is an eristaline species. Here is a honeybee, and here is the hoverfly up, the bigger one, the mimic and the model. Do we have any in the UAE? Well, we do. This is a rather poor image, so I've kind of kept it small, but this is also in the Aristolini group. And here is another one, another species that might show you the characteristics a little bit closer. So it's an Aristolinus. It has the spotty eye, so it helps me with the identification features. But can you see that on the hind legs, it even has these white parts, which is almost like a pollen basket on a honeybee. So it's got the stripes, and it has roughly the same size as a honeybee, and it behaves a little bit like a honeybee. And then it also has these whiter patches on the legs. So what I've done so far is I've talked about a lot of the species of Hymenoptera, so the bees, the wasps, and so on, that we know quite well. But there are, of course, also some that we don't know so well. And those are the solitary Hymenoptera. So I want to tell you that whilst we know so much about the bees and the wasps that make big colonies, there are so many species out there that don't do that, or do it on a much, much smaller scale, just really looking after their own brood. And these solitary Hymenoptera are sometimes smaller in size, they're more dainty, but very interestingly, we also have hoverflies that mimic those. And I just have a couple of examples. Well, one example, this is another Chrysotoxin, so it's very closely related to the really specific wasp mimic I showed you before, but it's just a little bit different and very similar to one of these solitary wasps. Do we have anything like that in the UAE? Well, I can't say that I've matched this particular fly up to a potential model, but it strikes me that it looks very, very similar to some of the solitary wasps that we do have in the UAE. And I have to tell you that this was also quite a new record when I found this in 2010. It's a Midas fly, Eremomydus arabicus. And this particular fly is a female, and the male looks completely different. It's about half the size, it's gray, and it has, in fact, antennae that look quite different. Now, the female has a very interesting behavior, and that hadn't been observed before that particular year. And then in 2010, it was both observed by me and also a researcher in Italy, and it answered a mystery that nobody could solve, which was that whenever in museum collections you would find a mydid fly, it was often covered in sand. Now, the curators used to think, oh, well, that's just because they're usually found in sandy habitats. But that's not the case. That's not the reason. The reason is that to lay their eggs, they bury themselves into the sand so that only the head sticks out and maybe the tips of the wings. And that behavior had not been seen before 2010. So again, contributions being made by many people. Hugh is one of the people who've contributed a huge amount of knowledge to the ecology. But it's the ecology that's so important to be able to think about the conservation of some of these species. Just having species lists isn't good enough. So this is so interesting to be able to then think a little bit more about the behavior of some of these organisms. Okay, so just almost a 3/4 recap. We've been talking about the defenses of organisms. We know that some have venoms or other chemicals that could defend them. Some of them have glands, others just are covered or have within their bodies some kind of toxin. But we also know that there are these organisms that don't have that. And in order to help them survive, they mimic. And so they mimic some of these rather more defended organisms like wasps and bees. But why would you be either a specific or a non-specific mimic? So why would you become so similar to one particular species? Or what is the idea behind being a more general organism? Well, a lot of that basically comes down to where you live. And to those of us who live or have a home in the UK or in Europe, will immediately recognize this as a bluebell wood. Now, a bluebell wood is a semi-natural ancient woodland in our minds. There are very, very few remnant forests left anywhere in Europe and in the UK that are still the original habitats that we would associate as being, you know, primary habitats. But nevertheless, these semi-natural ancient woodlands are really important because they house a lot of species that have evolved over time with these habitats and therefore have very specific habitat requirements and sometimes also are very, very seasonal to occur along with certain food requirements or other kinds of requirements. Now, in the UAE and the region, do we have these similar kinds of environments? Well, it might surprise you if I tell you, yes, and you're looking at one. I know it's not a woodland, but sand dunes are extremely valuable ancient habitats. Some of these dunes are paleo dunes, extremely old. We are so lucky in this region to be able to look at habitats that have been unchanged for a very long time, for millions of years. There are very few places on this earth that have that. Along with that, of course, we know that there are many organisms that occur in these dunes, and we know about the larger ones, but it's the smaller ones that we don't know so much about. And these smaller ones rely on these mass expanses of sea, if you like. It's like a sand sea, and this is the DDCR. And, you know, within these different habitats, there are so many different organisms that rely on exactly that habitat. It's just that we don't see them because they're extremely well camouflaged. They are very well adapted to the heat. They mostly come out at night. So they're so highly specialized, but sometimes people don't recognize that there are all of these organisms within these habitats. And so I think that sometimes these habitats, like the dunes, like the wadis, are not recognized as ancient and as extremely important to be conserved, and yet they really are. Of course, I have been focusing just on the terrestrial environment, but of course the marine environment is just as important, or any aquatic environment. They also have all very specific organisms that live within them that require to be protected. After that little rant, back to thinking about mimicry. And, you know, why would you invest in such intricate development of resemblance? Well, of course, it's because you are trying to avoid being eaten. And if you avoid being eaten, then you're going to try all sorts of strategies. And if we just imagine that it's a bird that might be the main predator of insects, well, you know, how does a bird actually learn when it can and can't eat something? Well, a lot of that time is when it's a juvenile bird. It also copies its parents. Of course, we know there are some birds that are extremely good at having learned to, for example, de-sting a bee, you know, a bee eater I'm thinking of. Or there are some birds like a shrike that know exactly how to deal with anything that might be dangerous. They just impale it somewhere and then come back and eat it later. But what we have to do is to understand the mechanisms of mimicry. We really have to think about what it's targeting. So if it's targeting a bird, well, you know, then how did a bird learn to avoid it? Do they have to learn through eating something that's poisonous or noxious first? Does that then protect everything that resembles it? Well, that was really the question of my PhD. And of course, all I could do was to fill, if you like, a little puzzle piece in the whole story. And of course, we all know, you know, birds don't see like we do. They have an additional spectrum. They can see UV reflection. And so we are making assumptions about good and bad mimics and behavior, all based on what we see. But this is why the talk is entitled In the Eye of the Beholder, because who is the beholder? And of course, it doesn't just have to be a bird. And we know that insects and arthropods, you know, form the food chain for many different organisms. And a lot of them are different kinds of reptiles here in the UAE. And these were all photographed here in the UAE. Including this little fella. And I just thought I'd give this one a little plug because this was a species that we didn't know occurred in the UAE until Drew Gardner said, well, this species must be here. Let's go and look for Pristurus carteri. And this was the day that it was discovered here in the UAE. And I think that's why it's smiling, by the way. And of course, it's not just reptiles. It could be other organisms like toads and many more. So the whole idea of resembling something that is somehow chemically or otherwise defended is to protect yourself from a predator. And with that, I'm going to end. I'm going to say thank you very much. And of course, I'm open for questions. But before we open up for questions, I just wanted to thank all members of our ENHG committee for facilitating the evening. I'd like to thank Sean for the photographs of the Truxalis. I would love to thank the DDCR for the continued collaboration and support that I receive. And then also really thank the ENHG and the members of the ENHG, because it's our collective interest that somehow is able to bring about these discoveries. If we hadn't been going out to IEW, to this field trip, this fly would have remained unknown. And through a lot of the ENHG's activities, a lot of us have become involved and curious and are now contributing. And maybe to end with the ENHG motto, which is, of course, observe, record, report. And I hope that, that I've done that to some extent. So with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay. And now then, I have no idea how we're going to do that. I can see that there are, okay, a few comments. Does anybody have a question?
Yep.
Yep. Hey, Salim. Yeah.
Yeah. Where did you get all these pictures from? Which part of UAE?
Oh, all over the UAE. Come on, in 21 years.
Yeah, exactly. Because some of them I hardly see them. Some of them you see. Some of them I've not seen at all. Yeah.
Yeah. I spent a lot of time in the last 5 years. I've spent a lot of time both in a desert environment, but also in wadis. Before the Bahraini border closed, I spent quite a bit of time there. There were very few pictures from Oman, actually. but certainly the last one of the fern was in one of the Oman oases. But yeah, all over. I mean, Wadi Kinan, Ras Al Khaimah is amazing for diversity of habitats because it's got sand, but it's also got the mountains. It has the sea, and so with this diversification of habitats, there are many, many species that you can find in these different areas. But just spending time at the DDCR over the last few years, there are so many species, both diurnal, nocturnal. We have so much biodiversity in the UAE, and the shame is that we still don't know which, all of them. The fact that we've discovered, two flies only within the last couple of years, and there are so many more. I mean, I give this speech all the time that Tony Van Harten in 7 volumes would have added thousands of species new to the UAE, of which almost 500 were new to science or had never been seen anywhere else apart from the UAE, been described for the first time from the UAE. So when you do that, it means you know absolutely nothing about their ecology, their needs, where they fit in, whether they're a keystone species. And so there's so much work that we need to do. We actually need an army of UAE national PhD students working on the ecology of all of these species in order to understand what effects there are going to be if we lose this biodiversity through habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, and so on, climate change. I don't know if that answered your question anyway.
No, yeah, because I remember when I was very young in Dubai, I used to never go to certain area because they're full of bees. I remember.
Oh, Salim.
Yeah, I remember this. We couldn't even go that side. And we
Yeah.
had to cover ourselves going somewhere else. But I expect a lot to see in Ras Al Khaimah and Fujairah, where it's much more greenery, greenery you can see there. So it's possible you can see more of the species there. Maybe I thought maybe you'd get it from there, some of them.
No, not necessarily. I mean, we could ask Hume. I mean, Hugh's been doing a several-year study in Al Wal here in Al Ain, and he has recorded incredible diversity there. And he also is a bird watcher and has added all sorts of records. So no, they are out there. It's just that the species in this country are so well adapted, Salim, that sometimes it's tough, and they're very seasonal, some of them. So you have to kind of be lucky enough to be out at a particular time of the year, to have the right conditions, the right flowering for this particular species to actually see all of the species.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Hi, Brigitte.
Hello.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. That was so interesting.
Oh, hi, Arabella.
Hi. Sorry, I can't put my camera on, but I'm waving.
Okay, no worries.
Behind the camera.
Yeah, that's okay, no worries.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is really mimicry, but I have an example from the marine realm that I thought might be interesting for everyone, and perhaps you can tell me if this is considered mimicry. So cuttlefish have an amazing ability to change the color and texture of their skin almost, or I guess the skin of their surface almost instantaneously.
Yes.
And one behavior you see is where some males are really cheeky and they will literally split their body in half, and one half they make themselves look like a female, they have female coloration, and on the other half they exhibit the male coloration. And the female coloration they angle towards other males that could be considered a competitor. Mm-hmm. And the female coloration they put towards males so that males don't see them as competitors, and the male coloration they put towards the females so that they can woo a female, but only on the side where the other males can't see. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was a really interesting, I don't know if that counts as mimicry.
Fascinating. Look, I mean, there's everything in there. There's almost aggressive mimicry, there's camouflage, crypsis. I mean, it's phenomenal. Yeah, I mean, cuttlefish are pretty amazing. I would say, yeah, why not? But I'm sure that particular set of behaviors might even have a particular name, where you're able to change the texture as well, because it's dynamic. It's whereas the hoverflies, they're born the way that they are and they stay like that their whole life. Whereas cuttlefish behavior can adapt to situations, which there's probably another more specific name for that.
Cool, thank you.
Great,
And
it's
thank you
cool,
everyone for
very
helping
cool.
tonight.
Cool example, thanks for that.
No worries.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi Bridget, it's Neil here.
Hello, Neil.
I've sent you a wee message on the chat, but
Okay.
I'll try and explain what I mean perhaps in long script. Obviously insects are millions and millions of years old. Some of the oldest creatures in our history. You look back at the layers that you dig down, you had monstrously large insects at the early days of the Earth because the oxygen level was so high. So they've been around for a very long time. Has anybody studied why a hoverfly looks like a bee? What was the mechanism millions and millions of years ago that split the two species off? I mean, were they at one time one species and then they developed on different paths?
Yeah, that's a great question. I can only give you the varied or the variation that I think is probably what happened. I know that you know that most organisms, let's take flies, they'll have a pretty similar common ancestor at some point. But we also know that over geologic time, there's been an explosion of species. And the reason for that is that species have been able to utilize different habitats in different ways. And one of the reasons for that is to avoid competition, of course. So, you know, whether it's intraspecific competitions or within the same species or interspecific competition between different species. And in doing so, by adapting to little different niches, organisms have been able to diversify, and we've seen more and more and more species over geologic time. But with that comes more pressure, because the more species there are, the more cunning you have to become to ensure survival. So I think syrphids, and not also, and it's funny because I took that one slide out because I was thinking this is already getting too long. But I did have one slide to show you not all hoverflies mimic. There are some that, well, I mean, they just don't look like, they just look like flies. I mean, maybe not like a housefly, but certainly not like a wasp or a bee. So not all hoverflies have got that mechanism to protect themselves, but there obviously was benefit in investing energy in resembling something that was toxic or defended somehow chemically. And when an organism evolves over time, it has to make decisions in terms of where to put the energy in order to give it the best possible strategy for survival. And so obviously it was worth over evolutionary time to invest in color because it is a diurnal organism. So it's an organism that flies during the day. It's very visible. And maybe that also means that the predator, therefore, has fairly good vision. And this is why we often think that it's birds that were the selective pressure. I use this example with my students. Imagine we're standing in a woodland and there are two types of one species of beetle, but half of them somehow seem to be a little bit lighter and half of them seem to be a bit darker. In the forest, you can imagine that the darker ones were very difficult to find to eat. So if I'm a bird and I'm hungry, I'll scour the woodland floor and I'll see one beetle that's a little bit lighter. And birds develop a search pattern. And once they've got that search pattern, they actually go back to that food source over and over again until it's diminished, and then they go looking for something else. So imagine that I see, you know, this lighter beetle, I go and I eat it. Well, very quickly, I could be reducing the number of beetles in that forest that are lighter by quite a lot. That means that the beetles that will be producing the next generation are probably going to pass on the darker genes more. Now let's imagine there's a forest fire and the ash is kind of gray. All of a sudden, the black beetles actually stand out, and suddenly the bird could hone in and actually feed more on those, and the ones that are slightly lighter might be better able to hide themselves. And so I think it's really Darwinian theory in a way, where you get the selective pressure helping to produce the different species and the different colorations that there are. Maybe some flies that had a few stripes through some kind of mutation had some kind of benefit in surviving better, and then that evolved into more color patterns. Of course, you can imagine that this very close resemblance between a particular model and a mimic must mean that it's taken a very long time to evolve in a particular habitat. I hope that answered the question. It was rather long-winded.
Hi, I have a question.
Hey Arish, how you doing?
Alhamdulillah, fine.
Thank you, Arish. It was because of you that we had this lecture.
Well, thanks to everyone, for the whole team, for you too.
Okay.
My question is, do you know examples of insects that succeeded in changing their morphology to mimic other insects, but like they are still the same insect? They were not born with that morphology, they just changed it with time. And they are not a new species or something, they are still the same.
I don't think I know of insects that can do that offhand. I know of other organisms that can do that. I can answer the question a little bit differently, Arish. The hoverflies, they're quite interesting because we call it melanism when they are yellowish or darker. And it's actually been proven, again, I think it's by Graham Holloway and his group, that when the larvae develop in the ground, if it's a particularly cold winter, they come out looking darker. And if it's a very hot summer and the larvae are in the ground, they seem to come out a bit more yellow. So there's obviously something linked to temperature that determines what the adult eventually looks like, but the adult doesn't change. Now, but I haven't, like I couldn't tell you for sure that there aren't any insects that change color. There are some that are quite metallic, and you could argue that they look different, and some butterflies that when the light shines at them in different ways, that they reflect color in a different way, and Binish would be able to answer that better than me. So there is that, but I'm not aware of any insects that can change their morphology. Except for sometimes they look different as a larvae than when they're an adult, or if they are a species that has a variety of nymphs, the younger nymphs can look very different and look like one organisms, and the adult look very different again. So that's also possible. I hope that answered your question. Any other questions?
Can I throw back this one? It's along the lines that you're speaking of there. Not
Right.
entirely identical, but I believe it was Lake Washington in America. It was particularly polluted, and there's pike and there's sticklebacks. So the sticklebacks in the polluted water didn't grow any sticklebacks. They didn't grow the spines that protected them from the pike, because the pike found it exceptionally difficult to find them in the dark water. So we came along and went, oh, it's a terrible lake, let's clean it up. And within the year, these sticklebacks had started to grow the spines again because the pike were finding them. So there must be something within the genes that they can turn this off and on. I mean, it's not an evolutionary process where they gradually grew back their defensive mechanisms. They grew them back in that generation.
In that generation, possible. Like I don't know enough about fish, but I know that there is something known as the ecology of fear, which is kind of closely related to what you've just said. But I can give you another example of fish, where, for example, the same species of fish in a particular environment where there are a lot of predators will develop smaller and paler than in an environment where there are no predators, where the male can look bright red. And of course, the reason for that is that it looks more attractive to the female. But in a high predator environment, it doesn't. It has evolved away from that. So there are quite a few mechanisms that do that. And the ecology of fear is where organisms behave differently if there is a predator around. And there's these studies done in Yellowstone National Park where if you have wolves around, then is it elks? I can't. The mammals. I don't know as much about mammals. They behave differently. They hide much more. They utilize habitats in a very different way than when the predators are around. And so this is a little bit similar, because don't forget, to grow spines costs energy. Energy is limited. This is why organisms have diversified so much in so many different ways to make the best use of energy and be able to have as many generations as possible, because the ultimate success of a species is to reproduce and produce offspring that can themselves reproduce. So it's all linked with energy and conservation of and making the best use of. So that's my way of answering that question, but I don't really know much about sticklebacks.
It wasn't quite the same subject, but it was on the explanation I could
Okay.
find.
Yeah. Well, it's strategies.
A change in genetics. I mean,
Yeah,
the fish doesn't change, it doesn't grow wings and fly out of the water or anything silly like that. But I just wondered that genetic pattern, genome, whatever it is, and I'm no biologist in this one, though, has been studied to show that these creatures have an ancient DNA that allowed them to make these changes. Because it sounds very much as though the fly is looking at the bee and going, oh, it would be good to be a bee. And that just sounds so stupid, you know, that it has the intelligence, firstly, and then the ability to change it. So that's why my original question was, once upon a time, the same creature, in effect, as much as the birds on the Galapagos Islands, beaks changed and became different species.
Yeah, I think bees and wasps have been quite different on the evolutionary tree, but I'd have to look at that. But yeah, because the flies are quite different. But yeah, I'd have to look back on basically on the evolutionary trees to see how far back the insects go, and when did diversification of bees and flies happen. But yeah, interesting question. Thanks for that. Can I ask, is there anybody else who's got a question?
I'm interested in being a zoologist, but also I'm interested in what's happening behind you. Can you tell us a bit about the room?
Oh gosh, I can indeed. Thank you, Cindy. Is that Cindy? Are you Cindy?
No.
That's me.
Hi, Cindy. What's your name?
Aurélie.
Lovely to meet you. So I'm going to turn a light on. I'm not sure if that's actually going to help it, but so I'm really lucky because being interested in insects, I a few years ago, together with a friend and former chair of the Al Ain Natural History Group, Brian Holmes, were asked to help out our colleagues in Abu Dhabi when there was a building that was being destroyed in order to build the new bridge in Abu Dhabi. And we knew that in this archival material somewhere there was an insect collection. And so I went along and I found it. And so there are specimens, these are not part of the really old ones, but there are specimens that date back to the 1970s and 80s that were collected by the original people that started the group from habitats that no longer exist in the UAE. But at the same time, of course, what we're doing is we're building reference collections, because if we don't know what occurs out there in an environment, we can't protect it. So we have to study the insects and the other organisms. And for insects, you need a reference collection, because otherwise, how can you compare the insects that you find? How do you know what they are? So I have in this room millions of insects, I would say, collected in different ways and by different people. And then we organize them. And then this particular drawer, in fact, was created, or the specimens were collected by someone called Mike Gillett, who published in our natural history journal called Tribulus. And he was one of the first people to put together, if you like, all of the different grasshoppers that occurred in the UAE and northern Oman. And then when he left the UAE, he donated the specimens to our joint arthropod collection, which I'm the curator of and the custodian until my death. So this is something that is very important to me. But you know, sometimes people come and help. I mean, if we ever allowed out of our Emirates, I don't know which Emirate you're in or where you are, but you're very welcome to come and visit the collection and to see whether you'd like to help at some time. Okay, does that answer your question? I want to say
Yes.
one other thing about that to you. Sometimes people don't like the idea of, you know, here you are trying to write conservation plans and trying to protect nature, and why are you collecting? So I had this feeling when I was studying hoverflies for my PhD, and I remember meeting my mentor, the first person to write a book in the UK on hoverflies. And it was a morning at breakfast time, just before we were going out to collect flies. And I sat with him and I said to him, Alan, I'm really worried about going out and collecting flies, because, you know, we're looking at some of these are very rare. You know, should we really be doing that? And Alan Stubbs looked at me and he said, okay, before you even get up in the morning, how many insects do you think one bird has eaten? And that kind of answered it for me, because the answer is a lot, right? And so me collecting one or two specimens in order to study them, in order to protect them, is okay. To collect for fun is not okay. To collect, to study, to learn, to contribute is absolutely okay, and is important for us to do. It's something that not many people are doing anymore. Hugh does it, me not, but there's not that many people out there. So we really need young people to come up and do more of it. So if you're interested, you've got to come and visit the collection. Okay.
Okay. Thank
Good.
you.
You're welcome. Anybody else have any questions?
Yeah,
Hey,
thank you.
Mohammed.
Yay. Do you think when the cutworm color, and then when the same caterpillar feeds on the leaves of maize, yeah?
Mohammed, we didn't hear the first part. I'm sorry, or maybe it was just me, but I didn't hear the first part.
Oh, okay. Do you I think
Can you type it for me? I'm so sorry, Mohammed, but for me the line was I just couldn't hear the question. But if you like, you could type it.
okay. I don't know if you can hear me now.
A little bit better. Let's try again.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Do you think noctuids, being pests, the cutworms, for example, when the same cutworm of a certain species is feeding on a tomato plant, it would change color, would look darker, and then if it feeds on, let's say, maize leaves, it would look lighter. Do you think this is mimicry, or is it just happens that because it's the host plant is, you know, she can jump, the caterpillar can jump from one host plant to another? Yeah.
I'm sure again there is a word for that, but I'm not sure if I would call it mimicry. But it's obviously it's almost like, it's not a photosensitivity, but it's a sensitivity to toxins that then bring about a reaction in the cuticle.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I would call it mimicry, but it could be it could be
Sorry,
a melanism.
yeah,
It could be a melanism. You know the story of the oh my goodness, what's it called? The peppered moth? Is it the peppered moth? Where Cyril Clarke was studying this in urbanized areas in the UK, where we had so much pollution that over time the moth actually became darker. because of the pollution, and so it blended in better. Whereas in areas that were not polluted, the same moth was much lighter, and so it could blend in much better. So it could be a melanism, but I don't know the mechanism like that. Yeah.
Yeah, but this also wouldn't be considered as changing morphology, colors. I mean, coloration. It's
No.
no.
I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a good example.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Great. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Brigitte, there've been some questions in the chat feed that you've perhaps not seen.
All right.
So there's a weird one from Mark Beach, and there was somebody earlier asking about visiting the collection.
Okay. Thank you for that, Geraldine. Thank you for the person. If you had to be reincarnated as an insect, which one would you choose and why? Oh my word, I've never been asked that question. I think it would have to be the bee fly that we found this year. Because I would love to be so rare that discovering me would be such a pleasure. So I think that is a beautiful fly. We were so lucky to see it this year, and we're just so happy to have discovered something new. I think off the top of my head, but I'm gonna think about that one and have a better answer ready for next time. Okay. So epigenetics, yeah. Okay. All right. So epigenetics is something that we can maybe have a look at. Is there any museum where ENHG is keeping the specimens? As a curator and custodian of the insects, they live in my house, but my house is often open for people to come and see the specimens once the pandemic has gone down a little bit. So absolutely be in touch with me. I don't know if my email was out somewhere, but I'll put it down here for you to get in touch with. So I've put my email there so that if anybody wants to be in touch.
Can I jump in here for a moment?
Examples. All right. Have I missed anything? What is the DDCR? Okay, the DDCR is the Dubai Desert Conservation Reserve. And we have very dear friends there. The conservation officers are brilliant, and we have some collaboration going with them and Zayed University. And I've got an ongoing project with looking at insects in the gaff trees there. So that's what I meant by the DDCR. Let's see. Oh dear, some of the images were partially cut off. All right, did I catch up with everybody? I think so. Cool. All right, folks. Well, if there's no other questions, let me tell you that we've kind of planned for a few more talks by me, just simply because I had given my committee a choice of 4 talks, and then they said, well, why don't you do them all? So I may do them all, and we did actually schedule them, but we will try and get some other speakers as well, and try and keep the momentum going. If you can, please go out, take photographs, even in your garden. I've discovered some amazing things just in and around my garden. You've seen now that some of these hoverflies occur on flowers, and you know, you don't need to go very far. Of course, it's nice to be out in the mountains, but in just your backyard, you can find some of these organisms. And it's great to see everyone, and thanks for joining from all the way around the world. And maybe we should say goodnight. Anybody who wants to chat, stay on, but otherwise, yeah,